Hello and welcome to Tank and AFV News. I'm Tom and this is the Tanks of World War II series. Now each episode we look at a different tank from World War II, starting with the beginning of the war and working our way to the war's end in 1945. Currently we are looking at the German invasion of 1940 and the tanks used by the French, British, and Germans during that campaign. We have just finished looking at all the French tanks in previous episodes, with only one left. And while this particular tank that we're going to cover had virtually no impact on the fighting in 1940, it's just too weird and interesting a vehicle not to include. So let's sit back and take a quick look at the super heavy tank Char 2C. The FCM Corporation started work on a heavy tank design during World War I, presenting their first version, the Char A1, for testing in December of 1917. It was larger than the British landship style tanks of the period, and borrowed from those British tanks the idea of the tracks going all the way around the hull, rather than the unsuccessful track designs of the French Schneider and Saint-Chamond tanks. The developmental details of these vehicles are fairly complicated, and since it really is a story that takes place in World War I, and of course this series is about World War II, we're going to skip most of it and move ahead to when the final iteration of the FCM heavy tank, known as the Char 2C, was introduced for service in 1921. Now originally, 300 of these monster tanks had been ordered, but due to the war ending, that order got reduced to only 10, which had been delivered to the French Army by 1921. Now these would be the last French tanks built for the French Army, really until the early 1930s. Looking back with hindsight, the Char 2C seems like a rather impractical and even fantastical design, but it made sense in the context of the World War I battlefield. The long length of the vehicle was deemed necessary to overcome the largest of the German trench systems. The armor, while seeming rather unimpressive by even early World War II standards, was thicker than the armor on any other World War I design by roughly double, and would have provided immunity for the most part from German anti-tank rifles or artillery shell fragments. The use of a turret-mounted cannon was a more efficient and effective way to mount the main armament than the sponson mounts on most World War I tanks. And while the vehicle has a rather large crew of 12, it's still less than the ridiculous 18-man crew of the German A7V. Now at around 70 tons, the weight of this vehicle is not particularly practical, although given its mission, this was not a tank that was expected to be traveling around great distances under its own power, but rather to punch holes in the enemy defenses that could then be exploited by smaller and faster vehicles and other forces. So the design makes sense, at least within the context of the First World War battlefield, and of course we have no idea how effective it would have been since the war ended before the Char 2C could be deployed. The first thing to note about the Char 2C is just how enormous this tank is. The vehicle is almost 34 feet long, or 10 1/3 meters. For sake of comparison, this is 2 feet longer than the Soviet T-35 heavy tank, and about the same length as the German Maus tank or the British Tog 2. Now the height of the vehicle is roughly 13.5 feet, or over 4 meters, making it 1.5 feet taller than the Maus, 2.5 feet taller than the T-35, and 3 feet taller than the Tog 2. It's narrower than all three of these vehicles, a factor that makes it look even taller in photos when viewed from the front, because of that aspect ratio of the vehicle, you could say. All in all, it's simply one of the largest tanks ever built, if not necessarily the heaviest. The Char 2C introduced a number of interesting technical advancements for its time. Now, at a time when most tanks still did not have turrets, the Char 2C sported 2 of them, including a 3-man turret mounting a version of the famous French 75mm artillery piece. It also had divided compartments for the driver, engine, and weapons, unlike many tanks of the period where the crew were sharing space with the engine and all the other internal components. In its final configuration, it could boast of having engines providing 500 horsepower, a really rather impressive amount for a tank of the early 1920s. Perhaps the most interesting technical feature of the vehicle are the stroboscopic viewing devices on top of the 2 turrets. Now these are very noticeable as they're quite tall and unusual looking, and so I wanted to spend some time trying to explain how these worked. The best information I could find as far as diagrams or anything, I had to go all the way back to my old reprint of Fighting Tanks 1916 to 1933, and I scanned the image so you can see it here. So what these sort of cupola vision towers consisted of is internally you have vision blocks and a mechanism that sort of provides power to the external shell of the tower, which spins. And that, I know, sounds kind of weird, but if you look at old video of these tanks, you can see the towers spinning. It's a little hard to see, but fortunately there is a lot of video footage of these tanks. And the way it works is it's sort of like, and I'm going to use my salad spinner for my kitchen as an example. They're sort of like this in that it's got a whole bunch of narrow slots in it, and when you're inside and looking out, obviously you can see little parts of the world through these slots, but when the whole thing's spinning, and unfortunately this effect doesn't come through very well on the camera, but when you're looking at it, and I think most of us experience this just looking at fans or propeller blades, it sort of becomes invisible as the eye kind of takes all those little pieces of visual information from those slits and turns it into a sort of almost a mosaic, a complete picture. So, yeah, I worked my salad spinner into an episode. That's pretty weird. The Char 2C could bring a considerable amount of firepower to the battlefield, having a 75mm gun in the turret, along with a machine gun in the rear turret. There were 3 other machine guns, one mounted in the front hull and 2 on either the hull sides. Armor protection ranged from 45mm at the thickest to 6mm at the thinnest. The 12-man crew was assigned to the following positions: driver, main turret crew of commander, gunner, and loader, and then the 4 machine gunners, mechanic, electrician, assistant electrician, mechanic, and a radio operator. Now, several different engines were fitted, but the final choice ended up being 2 250 horsepower Maybach diesel engines, which rendered a maximum speed of 9 miles per hour for this massive tank. Now, these engines were said to be originally intended for German Zeppelins, but were taken by the French as war reparations after World War I. Each engine ran an electrical generator, which then sent power to a pair of electrical motors that propelled each track. Fuel was provided by 7 different gas tanks placed around the engines. Like most French tanks of the period, the Char 2C could be equipped with a trench-crossing tail, just in case it was not quite long enough as is. Special dedicated railway cars were built to move these 70-ton monsters around. Each company, which consisted of 3 tanks, had a pair of special transport bogies for each tank, as well as 2 locomotives and 30 other rail cars carrying the crew, supplies, and supporting vehicles. The only variant of the Char 2C was a modification called the Char 2C bis, and this was applied to tank number 9, which was also named Champagne. Now, the primary feature of the bis variant was replacing the main gun turret with a new turret design, mounting a short-barreled 155mm howitzer, as well as an internal ammunition elevator. This conversion was done in 1923, and by 1934, Champagne was converted back into the standard Char 2C configuration. These tanks served in a number of different unit organizations, but by the mid-1930s they were becoming viewed as outdated as new French tanks were developed. Now, despite their obsolescence, these behemoths were called into service in 1939 and assigned to the 51st Battalion de Chars de Combat. However, they became more useful as propaganda instruments than as combat units for the French military, using them in numerous movies, showing the massive tanks crushing through obstacles and walls. Now, due to their use as morale-building propaganda tools, more movie footage and photographs of the Char 2C survived than some of the other less impressive-looking French tanks that were built in greater numbers. Now, each of the 10 tanks was named after a region of France, so they each had a unique name. By 1940, at the time of the German invasion, though, only 8 were operational at that time. Despite claims by German propagandists that these tanks were destroyed by Stuka dive bombers while being transported by rail, the truth is that 6 of these tanks were destroyed by their own crews. God damn. Despite claims by German propagandists that these tanks were destroyed by Stuka dive bombers while being transported by rail, the truth is that 6 of these tanks were destroyed by their own crews when it became obvious that they would be captured by the enemy due to blockages of the rail lines and the fact that they were unable by themselves to offload the tanks from the rail lines. Now, 2 other Char 2 tanks were destroyed by their crews after mechanical breakdown elsewhere. At least one Char 2C tank, the one named Champagne that we mentioned earlier, was captured reasonably intact by the Germans and taken back to Berlin as a war trophy. There really is not much to say about this vehicle in regards to its role in World War II. While impressive by 1920 standards, it's clearly outdated by 1940 and really only suitable for impressing crowds of civilians with its size and ability to crush things. That said, it included a number of innovative technical features. Frankly, it doesn't really deserve inclusion in this series based on its combat record, or lack of it I should say, but it's such an interesting vehicle that I figured it was worth covering. Also, I really want an excuse to use my salad spinner as a prop this episode, so, who knows what other kitchen utensils I'll incorporate into this series. We'll just have to see. Unfortunately, no examples of this vehicle survive to this day. Now, it is said that Champagne, the example taken to Berlin, was captured by the Soviets after they took the city and then hauled it away. Unfortunately, it did not get added to the collection at Kubinka and probably was scrapped, although no one seems to know for sure. Sources used in this video include Osprey New Vanguard No. 209 French Tanks of World War II Volume 1 by Stephen Zaloga, Osprey New Vanguard 216 Super Heavy Tanks of World War II by Kenneth Estes, Profile AFV Weapons 58 French Infantry Tanks by James Bingham, and The Fighting Tanks 1916 to 1933 by Jones, Rary, and Ikes. And of course, as with all these videos, the Encyclopedia of French Armored Vehicles 1914 to 1940 by Francois Vauvilliers. We hope you have enjoyed this video. If so, please subscribe. If you want to support the series with a donation, be sure to check out our Patreon page and sign up as a supporter. Just $1 a month. Every little bit helps. This is sort of a special little short episode that I'm kind of cramming into the schedule, and hopefully once this goes up, then this next weekend at our usual time for new episodes, which is sort of Saturday nights, we will start to dive into the German tanks of the French 1940 campaign, starting most likely with the Panzer 38T. So until then, stay safe, and we will see you soon.